we're going to be serious about reducing CO2 emissions, then the way forward is end to end, natural gas to nuclear. And I haven't changed my mind at all.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Breakthrough Dialogues, the podcast for pragmatists and problem solvers brought to you by the Breakthrough Institute. I'm Alex Trembath, your host and deputy director here at Breakthrough. For this episode, I spoke with Robert Bryce. Robert has been writing on energy issues for years, including a couple really great books called Power Hungry and Smaller, Faster, Lighter, Denser, Cheaper. He most recently produced a documentary called Juice and published a book titled A Question of Power, both of which are about the role of electricity in economic growth and human development. I've known Robert for years, and I've really appreciated his work. He takes climate change seriously, but considers the trade-offs between climate, human development, and technological systems more critically than most, I think. Robert and I were supposed to do this recording in person, but ended up doing it remotely after the COVID quarantines were put in place. Nonetheless, I hope you enjoy this conversation.
Robert Bryce, thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks, Alex. Glad to be with you.
So before we get started, you and I have been friends for a long time. We've known each other mostly through my work at the Breakthrough Institute and your work on energy for several years now. So I feel compelled to start by asking how you're doing. You know, we're recording this on April 3rd, several weeks into the national quarantine and the reaction to the coronavirus. And so I did just want to start by asking, as you're publishing this book, as you're dealing with the coronavirus in your own life, how you're holding up.
Well, thanks for asking. I'm holding up fine. I mean, it has been difficult, though. In fact, I was just talking with a friend of mine about being able to see my children. You know, with Lauren and I, my wife and I, have 33 years together, and we have our oldest is 27, but she's keeping social distance from us. And I mean, as a parent, that's just hard. You know, not to be able to hug your child. And you know, I understand intellectually, I understand in my brain why, but in my heart, it's painful. To be, perfectly honest. And so, we have our youngest, Jacob, is living with us, and so we see him and all. But I mean, it's also just it's painful to see the how so many people are being hurt by this. So many people that are friends of mine, musicians here in Austin, bars, restaurant owners. I mean, I really feel for them because this is a very hard time.
I'm sorry to hear that, obviously, and it is something that you and I and really everyone is going through right now. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the coronavirus and your sense of its implications for electricity and energy systems. But before that, I do want to talk about your new book. The coronavirus interrupted a launch and a tour of your new book, A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations, which I was excited to have you into our office to talk about. Unfortunately, we had to end up doing this interview remotely. Still excited to talk about it with you here today. But I wanted to start by asking, why electricity? Why did you choose electricity as your subject?
I've been writing about the energy business now for 30 years, and this is my sixth book. But the more I learn about energy, the more I learn about energy and power systems, the more I began to realize, well, electricity is really the key. And about 4 years ago, the real impetus for this came about 4 years ago when I read an article, I believe it was in the New York Times, about problems in Nigeria with the Nigerian grid. And it spurred my thinking that I'd seen a piece on 60 Minutes, maybe in the 70s. I couldn't locate it, but Morley Safer was on 60 Minutes in Lagos. And there was this kind of smirk on his face because he was in a building filled with lead acid batteries. And he was making the point that this is the backup for Lagos's electric grid. Well, okay, so nothing had changed in 40 years. Well, so it made me really think again about, well, the story here is electricity. And the more I began looking at it, the more I became convinced, yes, exactly. There's a book here because electricity is the fastest growing form of energy. In 2018, consumption globally and in the U.S. grew by about 4%, which means it's doubling every 18 years or so. Now, of course, with the pandemic, that growth is going to slow or stop or even be reversed. But nevertheless, when you look at the major energy trends around the world, we're electrifying more and more of our society, whether it's through computers or even, talk about electric vehicles. We're people all over the world, when they want energy, the form that they want is electricity more than any other.
The dust jacket to your book says, historically, it was guns, germs, and steel that determined the fate of people and nations. Now, more than ever, it is electricity. And I wanted to ask you about that more than ever. So more than in the late 19th century when electric power systems and electric lighting were coming to towns in America, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere, more than the post-war period when electric appliances were scaling globally, nationally, and globally around the world. What is it about now, 2019, 2020, that makes electricity particularly important to the wealth of nations?
It's that all of the modern networks that we depend on are in turn dependent on the electric grid. So a lot of people are stuck in their homes and now, well, what are we doing? We're connecting, you and I are connecting through Zencastr on the internet, and that relies directly on the electric grid. You look at what the importance today for virus patients, coronavirus patients. Well, they're in hospitals. Hospitals are some of the biggest consumers of electricity of all of the buildings in the built environment. Nearly everything we read, eat, touch, or wear today has been electrified. That wasn't true when my mom was born in 1924. It wasn't true when my grandmother was born in, right near the beginning of the electric age in 1891 or 1892. So we think about we don't even think about electricity today except when there's a blackout. We only consider the importance of electricity in our daily lives when we don't have it. So the purpose of the book is to spotlight this and show just how dependent we are on it and how vulnerable as well we could be to a blackout or something else, particularly in times like today where we're we're grappling with a deadly pandemic.
In your book, you also mention a concept called the Terawatt challenge, which I was tickled by because that was a concept that first got me interested in studying energy issues when I was reading about energy and energy systems in college. It's a concept popularized by Richard Smalley in the late 20th century and used as a jumping off point for discussing energy systems, decarbonization, a whole bunch of things by a bunch of other scholars. So can you talk about the Terawatt challenge?
Sure. That's the last section of my book I call the Terawatt Challenge. And as you point out, this was coined by Richard Smalley, who won the Nobel Prize for inventing buckyballs. He typified it as the push to create a clean energy system and he had a vision for, an entire North American, South American grid. I use it to point out that over the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to have to double roughly global electricity production. We have about 6 terawatts or a little bit more of installed generation capacity globally, 6.5 terawatts today, 6 trillion watts, 6.5 trillion watts. Why do we have to double it? Well, because of economic growth, population growth. When you look around the world today, and this is one of the key points that I make in my book, is that there are roughly 3.3 billion people in the world today who live in places where per capita electricity consumption is less than what's consumed by my refrigerator. I used a watt meter, plugged my refrigerator into it. My fridge uses about 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity per year. There are 3.3 billion people today living in the world. Roughly 4 out of 10 people today on the planet use less electricity than my refrigerator. So how do we deal with that? What are going to be the electricity systems and fuels that we're going to use to meet that challenge of electrification? So that's what I use in that broad descriptor of the Terawatt challenge.
And it's a definitional problem too. And I appreciated the way that your book talks about energy poverty. The way you see it described a lot of the time is that, it's something like 950 million people around the world, according to the IEA and the UN, currently, quote, lack access to electricity. But the way that access to electricity is defined is, off the top of my head, something like 500 kilowatt hours a year. As you say, sort of less than half of a typical mid or large size refrigerator.
Per household, not per capita. And that was one of the points that I think is critical is that, to review what we talk about in the book is, or what I talk about, right? I trifurcated the world into 3 groups: the high watt world, the low watt world, and the unplugged world. Well, the unplugged world, as I said, these are people who live in places where consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. So roughly a third of those, or about 1 billion people, have no access to electricity at all. And so even the other 2 billion are using electricity at such low levels that you can't be considered participating in modernity. It's simply not enough electricity to really alleviate the crushing poverty that is in particular affecting women and girls.
And you mentioned that electricity is the fastest growing source of energy in the world, not just because of this massive inequity in electricity access and electricity consumption today, but because electricity use is growing in all parts of the economy, in sort of rich, middle income, and poor, high tech, low tech, as we electrify other parts of the economy that haven't traditionally relied on electricity before. And I've been a little frustrated with the sort of electrify everything discourse with respect to climate change. I think it's very often used as a sort of hand wavy, magical thinking thing. Like planes and fertilizer factories. We were just going to electrify these things and plug them into, 100% renewable energy grid. And that's how we're going to get to 100% low carbon energy systems. That said, electricity is a very powerful energy carrier. And I think that we can, should, and certainly will electrify large sectors and use cases that aren't electrified today. So what do you make of the whole electrify everything discourse? What do you see as most likely to be electrified in the coming decades?
Well, I think a lot of the electrify everything viewpoint is just simply, silliness. Your point, to your point. Well, okay, electrify everything. Well, where are we going to get fertilizer? You're just going to throw out the Haber-Bosch process and then not have nitrogen-based fertilizer? Where are you going to get it? What about steel making? What about plastics? What about cement? This idea that we're just going to suddenly drop hydrocarbons. It has nothing to do with reality. It's just this kind of fantasy world that a lot of academics and theoreticians come up with that will electrify everything. Well, you do that, and I'm pro-electricity, I'm pro-energy. You do that, you also make the grid more vulnerable. So, there's no doubt that electricity demand is growing, and it's growing in the computing sector. One of the things I talk about in the book is, in fact, the soaring demand for electricity for marijuana production, and how much electricity is being stolen to grow weed. But yeah, there will be some success, I think, in electrifying parts of the transportation sector and light vehicles, although I think that's going to be fairly limited. But yeah, you look around the world at the increased demand for electricity, and it's in broad swaths of the economy, and we are becoming ever more dependent on reliable and abundant electricity, particularly now during the pandemic.
You mentioned marijuana cultivation. Were there other sort of emerging industries or informal industries or new use cases or technologies that the book research introduced you to, brought you to, surprised you, that brought you to interesting stories?
Sure. One is the tech sector, and I look at what I call the giant five: Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. Their electricity consumption is doubling about every 2 years. As far as I know, I'm the only one who's done this research, but I looked closely at those five companies at their own corporate reporting. Amazon doesn't disclose their electricity use, but the cloud, with now in particular, in fact, there was a piece in the Wall Street Journal. I have it right here on my desk. It was last on March 28th, 29th. Cloud industry scores big win. That the demand in Australia has gone up something like 7-fold with people stuck at home. So that as Amazon and Microsoft, all these companies, they're the digital realty, Netflix, Amazon Prime, all of these things that iTunes, we take for granted. Well, those require massive data centers, and those data centers require massive quantities of electricity. And one of the numbers that I have in the book, and I've been updating it since then, but today, by my latest count, those five companies consume over 30 terawatt hours of electricity per year, which means as a whole, they're consuming more electricity than Denmark. So, these are very large numbers.
So this book research did take you all over the world, and I wanted to ask initially about your travels to India, which I know were facilitated by Joyashree Roy, who is a mutual friend of ours and a senior fellow at the Breakthrough Institute. So I wanted to ask you sort of why India, and what did your experience with Joyashree and the folks that she introduced you to teach you about emerging economy electricity systems, about India, about electricity generally?
I think the most important thing that we got from India, and I'd wanted to go to India for a long time, but I also knew that India has the biggest electrification challenge of any country in the world. The country has 1.2, 1.3 billion people. They have 300 million people roughly in India who have no access to electricity, which is really it's not kind of mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling that you have a population nearly as large as the United States that has no access to electricity. So I knew the challenge was big, and I wanted to go to India in part because Joyashree Roy, who's a mutual friend of ours and just a lovely person, I mean, just a gem of a human, she offered to host us, and she facilitated an interview that, it sounds trite or trivial maybe to say it, but really did change my life. And it changed the course of the book that I finished. It changed the documentary that we finished, and it will be out in June on iTunes, Juice, How Electricity Explains the World, which we showed at the Breakthrough Dialogue last year. But Joyashree took us to a small village southeast of Kolkata called Majlishpur. And there I met a woman named Rehena Jamadar. And this Rehena was 44 years old when I met her. She'd had her first child when she was 16. She only had electricity in her home for the previous 14 years. She'd lived more, 2/3 of her life effectively in the dark. And being able to have that interaction with her, and Joyashree translated from Bengali into English, and talking with Rehena. And I asked her one question. She had a daughter that was going to university and was able to do so because there were lights in the house, so her child could work at night, do her studies at night. I asked Rehena, I said, if you'd had lights when you were a child in your house, would you have gone to the university as well? And she looked at me dead level and said, yes, I would have. And I just thought, man, here is a woman who knows that she could have had a different lot in life if only she'd had electricity. And it really, as I think about it today, it still affects me because it's such a vivid example of human potential that's been wasted because of the lack of something that we take for granted.
The book, like you said, is sort of full of different experiences of yours traveling around the country and around the world. Where else did this book take you?
We went to India, Iceland, Lebanon, Puerto Rico, New York, and Colorado. And Iceland was fascinating. I'd been there once before. Lebanon was extraordinary. I'm not dying to go back to Beirut, but what we saw in Beirut reinforced what we saw in Puerto Rico, which was that electric grids will shrink until they can be assured of integrity. And in Lebanon, corruption is rife. The city of Beirut has been a battleground now for decades. All these different factions. Hezbollah is supported by the Iranians. The Shiites, the Shia, the Sunnis and the Christians share power in Lebanon, but it's a volatile mix, and the grid operates very badly there. So the result is that there are blackouts every day in Beirut that are at least 3 hours long. So essentially, everyone in Lebanon pays two electric bills: one to the grid operator, EDL, and another one to the generator mafia. So everyone depends on a local generator, and the generic term is the generator mafia, and they pay as much to the generator mafia to assure electric power as they do to the grid operator.
I have to say, one of the things that I really appreciate about your book is that it is a book about energy and electricity purely. So I feel like most of the work that you read on energy systems these days are at least much more aggressively about climate change, if not sort of reserving a lot of attention for climate change, which is fine. Obviously, climate change is a real problem, but it's not the only lens upon which to look at the sort of problems and virtues of different energy technologies and energy systems. That said, you do talk about low carbon technologies and climate change and decarbonization in your book. So I wanted to ask you, as you as a scholar of energy and electricity systems for a few decades, and as someone who has now gone through another project and writing this book, where do you come out on sort of low carbon technologies on the electric power sector and deep decarbonization after writing this book?
Yeah, great question. My view on that has not changed in 10 years. 10 years ago, I published a book called Power Hungry. And in Power Hungry, I wrote about end-to-end natural gas to nuclear and pointed out that if we're going to be serious about reducing CO2 emissions, then the way forward is end-to-end natural gas to nuclear. And I haven't changed my mind at all. And I had to look up the subtitle, Power Hungry, the Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. And the real fuels of the future today are the same ones as they were 10 years ago. Natural gas consumption, natural gas production globally has soared. And I think will continue rising because the gas is not just abundant, it's super abundant. And nuclear, I'm very hopeful on nuclear. In my view, if you're anti-carbon dioxide and anti-nuclear, you're pro-blackout. I'm opposed to blackouts. Blackouts are bad. But nuclear isn't growing nearly fast enough today to make a big dent in the Terawatt challenge. I'm encouraged by some of the recent developments in nuclear. Oklo's recent announcement that they've submitted an application to NRC. The NRC is great news. But nuclear is facing a lot of challenges. So natural gas, nuclear, I'm also bullish on solar. To be clear, I'm a longtime critic of the wind industry. I think the wind industry is facing the wind industry is facing enormous challenges, both here in the U.S. and around the world, particularly in Europe, over land use conflicts. And that is hindering the growth, and I think will dramatically slow the growth of the wind industry because of the footprint problem. Solar, I think, is going to grow. I'm pro-solar. I have 8.5 kilowatts of solar panels on the roof of my house. We saw in Lebanon how solar and storage can work. We saw it in the Shuf Mountains, southeast of Beirut, where there was an entire resort that was running on 100 kilowatts of installed solar panels made in China, and the electricity was being stored in 300 kilowatt hours of lead acid batteries that had been made in India. So I think solar and storage has a very bright future, to make a little pun. But I think if at scale, and by that I mean at the gigawatt and terawatt scale, we're going to be utilizing more natural gas and nuclear if we're serious about pushing forward on decarbonization.
Yeah, and this is something, again, that you and I have talked a lot about and that Breakthrough has written a lot about. You know, I think a lot of the enthusiasm for sort of conventional renewables, solar and wind, is very well intended and oftentimes very well based. And the caution that we try to remind people of is that there was, if anything, sort of a lot more enthusiasm for conventional nuclear technologies in the 60s and 70s. And we all see how that turned out. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the sort of nuclear renaissance of the post-war era stalled in the 80s and 90s, but it did stall. And for a whole bunch of reasons, you're actually seeing a slowdown of growth rates in solar and wind in major economies around the world, in Germany, in Spain, in the UK, in the United States. The growth rates of these technologies are not exponential; they're more logarithmic. In the meantime, technologies like advanced nuclear still have quite a bit to prove. Our loyal listeners will remember the episode we just did with Lenka Kola of NewScale. Robert, you just mentioned Oklo. My major point being is that we do have some very encouraging signs from solar, from nuclear, but we're talking about a 15, 18, whatever it is, terawatt planet. We need technologies that scale much more than to the sort of 5 to 10% of electricity systems, which themselves are only a quarter to a third of national energy systems, to really get a handle on deep decarbonization. And we really don't have all the technologies that we would need to get to close to zero carbon today continues to be sort of the main point that we want to inject into this conversation.
And I think it's critical that, it's always about scale. In Power Hungry, my fourth book, there are the four imperatives: power density, energy density, cost, and scale. And power density matters. We need sources that have small footprints. Energy density matters. We need sources that can be contained in small volumes. That's why we use gasoline, because it's just a miracle substance. Cost, obvious, but scale, the idea of, okay, well, the U.S. has 100,000 megawatts of wind now on the system. Okay, well, that's great, but we need systems that can scale to the gigawatt and terawatt scale, and that can do so globally and with minimal footprints that can be deployed in relatively short order. And by that, I mean the next 10 years or so, 10 to 15 years. So I'm glad to see the progress being made by NuScale. But the realist in me says, okay, great. NuScale, you're going to deploy one reactor in maybe 5 or 6 or 8 years, and you're going to do it at Idaho National Labs, and you're going to have, electric output of 60 megawatts. Well, okay, that's great, but it's only 60 megawatts. We need 600,000 megawatts. We need 6 terawatts. We need vastly more than that, and we need to be able to do it really quickly, because if we the nuclear provides, in my view, nuclear and natural gas provide the only scalable, viable, low carbon alternatives to coal. And coal's share, as I point out in the book, the global electricity production has been at 38 to 40% now for more than 30 years.
Well, I like to remind people that, we are talking about the very, very early days of something like advanced nuclear, or even sort of solar and storage technologies. In a way that's really fine. I think a lot of the sort of emergency posture towards decarbonization comes from a sort of arbitrary treatment of the year 2030 or even the year 2050 as the period in which we must get to 100% zero emissions globally in order to deal with climate change. And that's another thing that we at Breakthrough have tried to push back against at least a little bit. We may only have a handful of advanced reactors deployed in the 2020s. Hopefully, there'll be many more in the 2030s, and then maybe we start to approach the terawatt scale in the 2040s, and that actually puts you on a fairly optimistic path for something like advanced nuclear. You could tell similar stories about solar and advanced solar technologies, and that the stories are actually a lot more optimistic in my view when you remove them from these conversations about having to decarbonize by 2030 or meet the 1.5 degree target or whatever.
Right. No, I agree with you. And I think that, some of those targets are completely arbitrary, but this is the world that in which we live, that, we have to do it by this date. Well, why? And the other wild card that I think is really, I've thought quite a lot about in the last few days and the last couple of weeks is, okay, well, what will the world look like in a year or 2 or 3 if, due to the pandemic, you have national governments that have exhausted their economies and their treasuries trying to deal with just to stay afloat, to not have economic collapse? Is the appetite for any kind of climate policy, whether it's renewables or anything else, is it going to be as robust as it is today? I don't have a prediction on that, but all this stuff costs money, and you have to have priorities. And so, that to me is and I quote Roger Pilkey Jr., another Breakthrough Fellow in the book, about the iron law of climate, that politicians will support climate policy unless or until it conflicts with economic growth. And economic growth is always going to win out. And so that's the part that I think is we will soon know, and after this pandemic abates, what that appetite for alternative technologies is in the power sector and transportation sector, what that appetite really is.
Yeah, so we were talking a little bit earlier about the pandemic. Outside of the politics, has the shelter in place and the quarantine and the other reaction to the pandemic taking place in your hometown in Austin and in Texas and around the country and around the world sort of taught you anything new about electricity systems, energy systems, or sort of made you realize or think more about these systems?
Well, I have a piece that I wrote that the New York Post is going to publish. It's going to be out in a couple of days, but it's something that I've thought about for a while. But it is the reality that, okay, well, we're more dependent on the grid now than ever, particularly in healthcare. And if you happen to get the virus and you happen to be on a ventilator, well, what do you want powering that ventilator? A couple of solar panels and a few batteries and maybe a wind turbine or two, or maybe a 2,000 megawatt nuclear plant. And I make this point particularly for New York because they're shutting down the Indian Point nuclear plant. So I think the pandemic has underscored the importance of electricity. But I think in the broader sense, is because I look at all energy sources, I've been stunned, frankly, about how it has killed oil demand, and that the knock-on effects of the crushing of oil demand is affecting the entire economy.
It occurs to me that it occurs to me that you were launching your book and planning on going on this book tour, like we were talking about earlier, right as the pandemic started to really take place in the United States. And it's pretty fortunate that we have pretty reliable electric power systems, things like Zencaster, things like the laptops and the microphones and the headphones that we're using to record even this podcast. Like you mentioned, electricity is kind of everywhere, and take it for granted in places like where you and I live in the Bay Area and in Austin, Texas, and very much not available in too many parts of the world.
Well, and again, it is the defining inequality in the world today. We can talk about, left, right, we can talk about Christian, Muslim, but the defining inequality is the availability of electricity. And one of the things that I've thought quite a lot about lately is, and I write about it some in the book, I didn't go into tremendous detail about it, but 2/3 of the world's Muslims, 2/3 of the world's Islamic population live in unplugged countries. They live in places where per capita consumption is less than 1,000 kilowatt hours per capita per year. So this disparity is really a key one, and it's not going to be solved in short order. This is something that's going to take decades to resolve. And one of the things that's also clear is we can't force electrification into other countries. Those countries have to electrify themselves. If they don't have integrity, if their system leaks too much, and if the people don't believe in it, then widespread electrification is really impossible. And they're going to have microgrids because the system it collapses because of corruption.
Yeah, we wrote a series of case studies that was published about a year ago called "The Road More Traveled," which was about the fairly uniform process that countries take, and it is countries, as you say. It's nations. It's not sort of sets of nations that build electric power systems, at least initially. And we found that there were a couple things you needed, sort of trusted and reliable institutions, whether those are utilities or a national utility or whatever. And you do need a centralized grid, at least to some degree. You need sort of standard equipment, standard plants. You need functioning markets, and you need sort of large scale power systems that actually sort of bring the power to the people, not just bring the people to the power. You need sort of modernizing energy and agricultural systems, and you don't really see widespread electrification or increases in electricity consumption without all those things.
Exactly, and I think that the key there is trusted institutions. And we talked earlier about Nigeria and the problems in Nigeria. Well, the corruption problem in Nigeria is generational. And it's not something that's going to be resolved in just a few years. It's going to take generations to get past that generational corruption and the tribalism that continues to dominate. Because, if the guy who was in office before you stole, well, why would you be honest? What are you, some kind of, are you an idiot? Of course you're going to steal, or not steal. You're just going to get a consideration for this contract or that deal or whatever. But yeah, I mean, the trust is the essential commodity. And as I say, there are three power imperatives: integrity, capital, and fuel. And integrity is the most important one. If the system doesn't have integrity, you're not going to get the capital needed to build a grid, and then you're not going to be able to afford the fuel, or you're going to be forced to use fuels that are dirtier than you would normally use. And that's one of the difficult challenges. In fact, there was an article just in the news the other day about, in Nigeria, a lot of people are sheltering in place. What are they doing? They're buying gasoline or diesel fuel because that's the fuel that they can afford. It's abundant, it's reliable, and it's not going to be stolen from them. So the one of the problems around the world is that generally the poorer the country, the worse or the dirtier the electricity, because they're having to use oil-fired generators.
I want to wrap up soon, but I did want to close by asking, we like to ask our guests about something that they feel optimistic or hopeful about in the world. I wonder, after sort of more than a year of traveling around the world, you made the documentary Juice, which we'll link to in our show notes. And we hosted a screening of it at the Breakthrough Dialogue last year. As you sort of ramp down off of this, multi-year project, are you sort of hopeful or optimistic about the future of addressing the electric power inequity around the world, about the future of electric power systems and technological innovation?
I am. And I am because if you look back 2 decades ago, in the last 2 decades, we doubled global electricity supplies. Well, if we've done it before, we can do it again. And the more we learn, the more solar panels we build, the more batteries we build, the more nuclear plants we build, the better we get at doing all of those things. So, my late friend Molly Ivins said she's optimistic to the point of stupidity. I'm optimistic as well. I think that, we face incredible challenges now, particularly with the pandemic. But, we also have the world's best scientists all working on the same problem, because it's such a big problem. Finding a vaccine, finding palliative cures, or who knows, hydroxyquinone. What is it? Anyway, but we're going to muddle through. We've always muddled through, and I'm very optimistic, and I think as a humanist, my optimism is based on this idea, as the late Freeman Dyson talked about. Look, if these people aren't going to stay in poverty, and keeping them in poverty is immoral. We need to help them come out of poverty and into the bright lights of modernity. And if it means a little more CO2 as we do that, well, I'm okay with that trade-off. But I think that's the trend that's going to be ongoing regardless of what we think, because people, that's the other thing that I think one of the other punchlines in a question of power, which was that people around the world are not going to just sit in the dark. They're going to do whatever they have to do to get the electricity they need, and well, they should.
I think that's a good place to end it. Robert Bryce, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks a million, Alex.
Thanks for tuning in to Breakthrough Dialogues. If you like our show, tell your friends, rate us, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or whatever platform you get your podcasts. I want to again thank my guest, Robert Bryce, and our producers, Alyssa Kadaman and Tali Perlman. Catch you next time.